All right, well, it looks like we have a good number of attendees, so we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, thanks for joining this Education Transformation 2020 presentation. The title is called It Can Be Done, Encouraging Student Research Presentations at Small Liberal Arts Universities. My name is Laura Chaplin, and our speaker today is Professor David Chaplin. I'll just take a minute to introduce you to David and give you a little bit of background about Professor Chaplin. He is a professor of economics at Northwest Nazarene University with over 25 years of teaching experience. He's the author of many scholarly, let me see here. Sorry, just wanted to make sure I wasn't muted. He's the author of many scholarly articles there in the realms of sports economics, economics education, and academic administration in higher education. We're excited that Professor Chaplin is here to share his experience and insight with us today. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. My colleague, Catherine Schaefer, is also joining us kind of in the background of the webinar today. She's here to help answer any questions throughout the webinar, so please enter any questions that you have into the Q&A box as we go, and she'll write back to you, and if not, Professor Chaplin will address those outstanding questions at the end of the presentation. But on that note, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Professor Chaplin.
Hello and welcome. I'm excited to have so many attendees here with us this morning or afternoon if you're in the UK, for example. So we'll get started in just a moment here. I'll get up the PowerPoint, and as questions come up, feel free to send those in to Catherine, as was mentioned earlier. Okay, so let me call up the presentation here, and hopefully my share screen is working well. Okay, so you see the title there. Nothing too exciting on that front. I'm at a small liberal arts university. We've got about 2,000 total students. About 1,200 of those are undergraduates, and the remaining students are in graduate programs up through a limited number of PhD programs that we have. Okay, the catalyst for this was that I kept getting these papers that were really something special in class. Granted, that was a very small percentage on average, but every now and again, a real gem would come through in a class, even down to the principles of economics courses, the first or second semester courses. So I wanted to incentivize the students to push on with that research and present at conferences. And so I've been able to do that with mixed results in terms of the recipients' zeal and desire to go ahead and present their research in this environment. I realize it could be very intimidating, concerns of cost arise, those kinds of things. So as we go through this, I'll talk about how I've been able to deal with some of those objections that inevitably arise. Okay. In terms of the student responses, it really is, historically for me anyways, it's been about 50-50. So about half of the respondents, before you even get that sentence out to encourage them to present at a conference, they say yes, right? No questions asked. They don't care about the fact it's going to cost them some money out of pocket, most likely, or any of the inconveniences, pre-COVID-19 of having to travel, miss class, etc. So I'll talk a little more about how I've been able to, in some cases, overcome objections. In other cases, there's an immediate wall put up and they just have no interest in doing it. And you have to accept that. And again, some kind of hold you to ransom a little bit and want their expenses paid. And those students, by and large, I've been able to accommodate if all other things point in the direction of them really wanting to go for it, but they're concerned about the financial implications. So how do you increase the probability of participation? Well, to be proactive about it, I've sought out funding through the International Honor Society for Economics, which is Omicron Delta Epsilon. It's the biggest economic society in the world, and we've got a good relationship with them. I was the founding advisor for them at my school in 2011. We got a chapter on board here at Northwest Nazarene University, and We've gotten many, many grants over the years with them. What's interesting is they offer matching grants. So they'll go up to 500 for these types of grants for research projects for students to present at conferences, etc. And your department could match it at 500. My department, unfortunately, has not had the resources to do that. So we've really been restricted to that $500 maximum that we've been able to get through Omicron Delta Epsilon. But we've gotten it over many, many different years and sent many students to conferences through that. And the conferences that we go to, normally $500 goes quite far. It may not cover everything, but it'll get close. A lot of conferences have been in the Midwest that are fairly cheap flights from my area, which is near Boise, Idaho. And the conference registration fees at the conferences we've attended have usually been pretty low as well, which has helped quite a bit. So I would encourage faculty to really look into internal resources from a matching standpoint or even a standalone standpoint to help complement any external funding. In my experience, unfortunately, it's really been restricted to the external funding, but that has been helpful for sure. And then talking to the students off the ledge can be very valuable. So assure them that they really can handle it, that you recommended them because you had belief in their skills based on their paper, and that they'll be able to prepare in advance, and you can help them with that for any grilling by attendees that they may receive. The main conference that I've sent my students to is the Missouri Valley Economic Association conference, which is very student friendly. So that's something I would encourage faculty to really look into. Is the environment there? Is it very hostile, which some of these conferences are known to be in economics as much as any other field? Or is it very encouraging and student friendly, even on down to the undergraduate level, which this particular one is. So I've been really grateful for that. At the conference, as best you can, try to make sure you're available. I've got a student presenting at this very conference that was scheduled for St. Louis. It's been moved to the virtual environment. It'll be mid-October. And so I'll make sure I'm kind of at least waiting in the wings if questions arise at the last minute, which often questions will arise in that panic as they get ready for their presentation. Ultimately, they're on their own when it comes down to brass tacks. I realize that, but you can do a lot to help calm their nerves, basically try to get them to predict the kind of questions that they may be asked, etc. If it's in the live environment, which we hope to get back to in the not too distant future, I would really encourage the students to take advantage of those social gatherings. And I always tell my students, that's where the real action occurs. So if somebody's very much interested in your paper, you may not get a lot of probing questions during your presentation and the immediate aftermath where there's discussion right there in the conference room. But those who are really interested in it may want to follow up and look at meeting with you, whatever, for the cocktail hour, dinner, what have you, in a more relaxed environment, separate from the intensity of the conference sessions in a formal setting. And so that's where you can really delve into it and perhaps build up collaborative research relationships as well. So that's something I make sure they have their radar on. Don't miss those lunches. Be prepared for pursuing questions even further in these informal settings. The breakout sessions or breakaway sessions rather, where people have coffee and donuts in the lobby. That can be another great environment there. And those looking to go on to graduate school, pick up hints, get a feel for the quality of the faculty based on the type of presentations you're seeing from different institutions, those kinds of things. So make sure you go to a lot of different sessions as well. And that's sometimes been tricky. Some students really just want to go worry about their own presentation, present and go home. But I try to encourage them to really take in as much as they can. They'll pick up so much from other presenters. Okay. some follow-up immediately after the conference. Obviously have a meeting with them and go through everything. I like to bring my students in to my classes and have them talk about their experiences at the conference, encourage my students that are working on their papers now to really go above and beyond the call of duty just to get a grade in the class, to really pursue excellence and hopefully get recommended for a conference as well. So that seems to work fairly well when they see one of their colleagues talking about their experiences, and even in places that you might think of as fairly low key and not as glamorous as some other big cities, somewhere like a Kansas City, there's still a lot of positive. You know, we're in a fairly small town of 85,000, and so Kansas City still seems like a fairly thriving, big, exciting place as one example there. So just the get out of town type of thing and get a new experience is something to be encouraged. Okay, so those are just some basic points I wanted to encourage people to look at. I've been very pleased that I've pursued students, our postgraduate students, to pursue this avenue to really enrich their educational experience. When I first started pushing students in this direction, I noticed there was a lot of resistance from other faculty, just from the standpoint of excuse making. We can't afford it. This isn't something we do. They're not going to be interested in it, the students, etc. So luckily, I didn't take any of that advice and cynicism on board, and I just continued to believe in the value of it and push through with it. So I'm going to leave it open for questions now. I didn't want to do all the talking, so I'll leave it at that and see what comes through. I'll stop the screen share.
Thank you so much for that. As a reminder, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And with that, Professor Chaplin, we do have a couple of questions here.
Okay.
One question, how do you motivate the students to do research in economics? And a second part is it graded work to start out with?
Is it graded work was the last part of the question?
Yes.
Oh, yes. That's a fantastic question. Yes, it is graded work, number one. And what that means specifically in my courses, so I'll give the example from my Principles of Economics course. It's usually 10 to 15% of the grade, the term paper. And what I do is I try to meet them at their point of interest. So I'll give 10, on average, 10 term paper topic options, and let them really explore something they're interested into within that context. So one might be from the sports economics realm. One might be very broad in terms of how well countries have done in fulfilling the obligations of the United Nations, Human Rights Declaration, those kinds of things. Looking at one of my presenters did their work on the worker cooperative movement, so worker self-directed enterprises. So that was really interesting. So 10 topic options is usually enough to, tie into the interest of virtually every student. They could pick something there that they can really gravitate towards and do some good work in. But to be honest, out of a class of 30, for example, it'll only be 1 to 3 papers, in my experience, that will be worthy of presentation at a conference. And I've found that it's usually those students that take some chances, that don't just paint by the numbers, but really gamble on themselves a little bit. They're a little bit more bold and daring in their writing. And I like that. And so those are the kind of papers I encourage particularly.
How do you motivate your students to do this?
Well, I motivate them first off by telling them up front that, this is a prospect, that I'm on the lookout for these kinds of things, and that historically we've been able to have people present at conferences. I'll bring in my current teaching assistant and tutor, who is the one who presented at the conference in Kansas City last year. And he speaks with, glowing reviews of how that all went. So those would be a few things. But I think the fact I give 10 different term paper topic options, I hope anyways, is some inherent motivation that they can really sink their teeth into something and work on it for its own sake rather than just for the grade.
Very good. Another question for you. Where do you find conferences for students to present their research?
That's great. Well, one obvious one by default came out of my own experience. I used to live in the Midwest in Iowa, and so the Missouri Valley Economic Association was a conference I had gone to many, many times. I knew it was very undergraduate student friendly. I knew it had low registration fees, particularly for students. And once I moved west to Idaho, I realized that the flight prices were pretty reasonable as well. So all those were factors. So much of it comes from the conferences I've attended myself, some as a student, but usually as a professor, and the experiences I had there. The Western Economic Association conference, which is closer to us, has much higher registration fees, and to be honest, is not very student friendly, even for graduate students. It's a much more hostile environment. So if I was teaching a lot of superstar students, I might feel comfortable throwing them in to the Sharks there, but for my students, a little kinder, gentler environment's probably the way to go for now.
Right. This next question, somebody asked, would you be going to these conferences anyway, or are you attending primarily because you have students going?
That's a fantastic question. It's really been mixed, to be honest. So there are conferences where I'm going anyways, and they take some comfort in the fact I'll be there. I find it not completely necessary, however. So for example, this last one in Kansas City, I actually had a conflict. So I couldn't be there anyways. And my student was fine with that. It doesn't seem to matter a whole lot. Again, if I had students that were super insecure and all, it might, but I don't think it's been that big a factor. You can do a lot of prep ahead of time before they fly out, etc. Luckily, my university has not been too concerned about, oh my goodness, you're sending them out to the conference on their own. You need to be there as a chaperone or whatever. It hasn't, hopefully it'll never get to that stage. And so it's nice when you can, though. It's, I've done that where, you can all get together at times. You can be there live with them. You can see their presentations live. So it is a nice feature when it works out, but I don't find it to be necessary.
Perfect. Another question, does your institution also have university-wide honor societies with national conferences with student presentations? So for example, Alpha Chi.
Oh, that's a good question. We do have an honors program. I'm trying to think. I think the conference presentations within our honors program have been more discipline specific versus on a broad base like the way Alpha Chi does it. Yeah. And I don't get the sense that they really aggressively pursue a great deal of these types of opportunities. It's a bit fragmented on my campus. I'm really the only one in the College of Business where I am pursuing it quite this way. We've got one finance professor that likes to bring his students to New York as a group, more as attendees, on Wall Street, those kinds of things. So I'm kind of the one, and we don't, in other departments on campus, we don't have too many faculty in my situation. There's a few, but it's 5% at most.
Okay. Also, kind of along with that, are there club activities where some students would be attending but not presenting?
That's a good question. For the things I've encouraged, that's not been the case. They've come as presenters. I would imagine it's feasible to get grant money even for pure attendees, if you will. So that wouldn't be out of the question. I would certainly encourage that. I would encourage them to go. And in fact, when I've had my tutor/TA come in who presented in Kansas City, he said that, just going to other people's presentations was phenomenal and really intellectually stimulating and all. So I would encourage it, but I start higher and really shoot for them to present. But if I saw resistance at all, but they still were interested and wanted to come, then I could also see them wanting to attend. And I think there would be support both from Omicron Delta Epsilon and my university for that.
Another question, do you think I can start the student research by first doing a presentation along with the student at a conference?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's common, by the way, where you see student and faculty research presented in a dual manner. I think the only time that looks clunky and strange, and I've seen this just a few times, is where they're trading off, like doing a newscast, right? So somebody's reading a few sentences and the other jumps. It's much better if you do segments and you say, okay, the lead professor, for example, does the intro and lit review, and then the graduate student, for example, gets into the methodology and statistical results and all that. And then professor comes back in for the conclusion and wrap up. So I do think that, that works fine. Again, because students tend to be a bit fearful and nervous going in, that offer could be very attractive. Not all students will feel the need for it, but I think that's a perfectly acceptable route to go. And I think it could break down some barriers if there's resistance from other faculty and your administration, et cetera, of, oh, geez, our students aren't ready for this. It's too scary. They need a chaperone, et cetera. That could soothe a lot of nerves, I think.
Right. Another question, we're getting a lot in.
Oh, good.
Of your students' research been published and not just presented in conferences?
I have co-authored a few. So they have not been individually published, but yes, I have co-authored a few papers with students that we have presented or, differently. I mean, some have been ones that I've presented and then the student jumped on as the co-author, right? Other cases, the student presented it and then we co-authored, they were the presenter of research that we had been working on, and then we published something. So yes, the short answer is yes on that one. It's been good.
Okay. I have a couple other questions. Is this benefit more for some disciplines than others?
Ooh, that's a great question. That's probably true without knowing the ins and outs of how it works everywhere. I know history does a pretty good job of having some, and even their Midwestern Conference for History is quite good at encouraging undergraduate student research and being a fairly friendly environment, those kinds of things. So I could think of a few other disciplines that are somewhat similar to economics in that way, but there may be fields where it's just not done, so to speak, that undergraduates presenting academic research at conferences is not normative at all. I can imagine that in some fields. So yes, I do expect some variance, but in some of the other aspects of business, so marketing, what have you, there tend to be also some pretty student-friendly presentation opportunities at scholarly conferences as well.
I would think psychology and some things.
That, yes. That could be a communications might be another, yeah. So there's definitely some other good ones out there. History is the only one I'm a little closer to that I think I've seen some good results come out of that.
The same instructor asks, are there undergraduate journal publication possibilities in your discipline?
I can't think off the top of my head of a purely undergraduate journal. That said, there with the anonymous review and all, there's still that opportunity. I haven't found that any stigma has been attached when I've co-authored with an undergraduate student for anything, whether it's a presentation, peer-reviewed journal article, etc. So, a short answer would be yes, in the sense that undergraduates certainly have that opportunity to publish. If the work's good enough and anonymous review, it should be able to get into any type of journal. My university's pretty lenient in terms of the types of journals that you get published in terms of them giving credence to it. Not all schools are that way. And so, you can encourage them to start at kind of a lower level journal, which at least in economics still has quite a bit of status in it. I mean, it still will have no more than a 15 to 20% acceptance rate. Even the lower level peer-reviewed journals, they'll still be indexed in EconLit, the reputable databases and all. So perfectly legitimate publications that they can put on the CV, and even if they became professors later on, would be able to wear with pride.
Very good. Another question is, what is the average age of the students who present?
They're quite young, actually. They're traditional undergrads. And what was funny was the guy who just presented is only 19 or 20. He presented as a sophomore, and it was interesting because, first of all, most of the people there are professors, of course. There's a smattering of graduate students, a smaller smattering of undergraduate students, but almost all the undergraduates were seniors at high level, large R1 institutions, right? Large state schools. And he's coming from a very small private school in Idaho, of all places. So, I personally like that. I like being the underdog and going into the lion's den, and I try to encourage the students to do that. And it worked out great. He found the students were really intrigued by the fact he came all that distance and from that type of school, because it's not the norm by any stretch of the imagination. So average age, probably 21. If I was going to put an average on all those who've presented in the past.
Okay.
Quite young.
Yes.
Yeah.
What degree does presentations help students get into graduate school? Is it necessary? And then he also says, I find particularly in small teaching-focused schools that research collaboration with undergraduates is encouraged as scholarship toward promotion and tenure.
Oh, yeah. Fantastic questions. The first one is it's becoming increasingly difficult to get into graduate programs. So we've all seen this. And so it's not necessary, number one, but I would think it's a big feather in the cap. No question about it. So it can only help. I would phrase it that way. Yeah, it depends. I didn't want to be too cynical when I was saying, the research has been kind of discouraged, that kind of thing. I think it depends a lot on the department. I think in the natural sciences at my university, they have a summer institute. They have funding for students. So that student research is very much encouraged there. I haven't sensed it quite so much in the College of Business. So there will be quite a bit of variance across the campus. Some schools would really treat that as a big component in the service element of their tenure and promotion application. And I would certainly, if I had been doing that, use it in that capacity. So you need to get a read on the overall university sense of the importance of that, as well as down at the college or departmental level, and play to it, so to speak. We all have to play that game, as the saying goes.
Just a few more questions. At the principal's level, are the papers more of lit reviews, or some data or statistical analysis is encouraged or required?
It depends on the topic, for one, but yes, in some of those topics, statistical analysis is required. Even it's often encouraged. It really depends. I've had students present both types, the almost entirely qualitative, if not entirely qualitative, and in some cases heavily quantitative. And so there is no one set way that it needs to be done. A lot of it would be, how well it's done is really what matters ultimately. And I always tell my students, you don't want to beg the question. So if you're doing an analysis where qualitative analysis really does make sense, that's fine. You're not begging the question. But if you're leaving out important quantitative analysis where there's adequate data out there to do such things, and you haven't done it, then you're begging the question. It's problematic. So I try to structure my topic options in a way where there's room for both. Those who want to gravitate towards the more quantitative, and those who want to do more qualitative. And some really do require even a 50-50 blending of the two.
Sure. Just a few more questions for you. Does your school or department have senior level capstone experience requirements?
Oh, that's a great question. We do have a capstone. I teach the capstone class, interestingly enough. And so ours is interesting because we have a social venture project. So they have to come up with a social venture, which is a business sustainable model. So it can't be, just like a charitable organization or something, but that meets a social need. And so they have to present this project in groups on campus. And then the top two teams, we usually have 7 to 8 teams. The top two teams, as selected by faculty vote, get to present up at Seattle Pacific University. They have a whole massive social venture plan competition up there. So there's two stages, the local one at my school, and then the top two teams advancing to that one. So the capstone requirement is not about doing, scholarly research in the traditional sense and presenting at conferences or anything like that. But it's a pretty serious requirement. We also have the ETS exam, the exit exam, major field test in business that we take very seriously. And I actually treat it as part of the grade. Not all schools do it that way, but it's 25% of the grade for our students. So the stakes are high.
Yes. All right, last question for you. With everything going on now and a lot of these conferences going virtual, how do you think this will affect your students presenting at these conferences?
Once again, a phenomenal question. And this is very relevant for me because my student's presenting on October 16th virtually. He was planning on going to St. Louis. And maybe it's just his temperament. I think a lot of students have been massively disappointed. He was mildly disappointed. Okay. And part of it might have been he just doesn't know any better. If he had done this kind of thing before, he might miss it more. So I'll know more after October 16th. But in terms, I'm prepping him differently than I would other people because for others, a lot of my encouragement is about that networking and really having the radar on for people really interested in your project, because that could lead to collaborative research. That could, if it's a faculty member at a school you're pretty impressed with, that could lead to better chance of getting into graduate school, those kinds of things. So, I'm going to have to prep him a little bit differently in that regard. But the same things about, being in tune with your audience, not just reading off your PowerPoint or paper, those kinds of basic skills for the presentation itself won't really change.
Okay, very good. Well, I think that's all of our questions for today. Laura, I'll let you take over from here.
Those were great questions, everyone. Thank you so much for using the chat box for those. And it looks like we got to everyone's questions, so that's great. Thank you so much again, Professor Chaplin, for your presentation today, and thank you for all the attendees who joined us. If you have any Hawks-related questions, you can direct them to us at marketing@hawkslearning.com. And following the presentation today, we will be emailing you a link to view this webinar on demand, and I hope everyone has a great holiday weekend. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody. I really appreciate it and looking forward to more of these types of things in the future. All right. All the best. Yeah. Have a great one. Bye.